So, Chapter 16, the Cold War. So, kind of the big thing to be paying attention to throughout this is the causes, main events, and also the effects of the early Cold War. And we'll kind of finish the Cold War up in a couple different chapters down the road. So, one of the kind of effects of this is when you start talking about a Cold War that lasts 46 some years, it's going to have an awful lot of impact on popular culture. So, we see that in a lot of the movies. We also see it in athletics. We have a couple of different Olympic boycotts because of the Cold War politics. And so this is really going to kind of shape a whole generation of Americans and then how they view the world and the movies that they make and the stories that they tell. And so that's something that's kind of a lasting impact. So the very beginning of this is how did U.S. leaders respond to the threat of Soviet expansion in Europe? So we'll look at, or the things to really kind of be paying attention to through this, is how this alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to unravel, and it's going to happen pretty quickly. The way that President Truman's going to respond, and we'll talk about President Eisenhower a little bit down the road, and then we'll also talk a little bit about President Kennedy. We're just going to kind of get to the beginnings of that, and then we'll finish that up in another chapter. And then the causes and the results of Stalin's blockade of the city of Berlin. So when we look at January of 1949, what is really kind of weighing on Americans? And so these are the things that are kind of keeping people up at night. These are the things they're fretting about and worrying about. And we can see in 1949 that it's pretty evenly split between the economy and also international issues. So the economy, the big things are the inflation, the cost of living, how we're going to make ends meet. But on the other side of the coin is the threat of war, the threat of communism. And so those are the things that in 1949 Americans are worried about. And we'll see how that changes and progresses as we go. So when we look at the roots of the Cold War, this thing traces all the way back to really 1918, 1919, when President Wilson sends troops into Russia to influence the outcome of their communist revolution and the civil war that's taking place within the Soviet Union. So from that moment forward, they're always kind of a little bit distrustful of the United States. But at the heart of all this, the root of all this, is that these are just two very different systems that you can see playing out there. Even when we look at, for example, this famous 1980 hockey game, the Soviet Union had this hockey team that really was developed from a very early age. It was almost like a machine. And you can kind of see that in the Rocky 3 or 4, whichever that is, with Rocky boxing Drago from the Soviet Union. But on the flip side of that, you had the United States who used non-professional hockey players. These are college kids that they throw together and they have to try and come up with a system and win with very little experience. And so there's just two very different systems, and we can even see that in their Olympic and athletic programs. So another thing that's really going to kind of kick this off is some disagreements or misunderstandings, or who knows exactly how these things developed. But both sides feel like they kind of understand the way these things are going to be handled very differently. And so that's going to cause a lot of friction and tension. One of the big issues is, what are we going to do with Germany at the end of the war? And what about free elections in those areas that are being circled in Eastern Europe? And so for the Soviet Union, they think Germany is going to be divided forever. And we believe that those places that are circled are going to be able to have free elections and maybe develop some kind of democracy. And that was what was decided at Yalta. At Potsdam, we now have Harry Truman, who's president of the United States. And we see that Truman is going to hold Stalin's feet to the fire a little bit on this. And he's going to pressure him about free elections and having free elections. He's also going to pressure Stalin about getting into the war against Japan. And really what's going to come out of this meeting at Potsdam is that the United States is going to be in one corner and the Soviet Union is going to be in another corner. And even though we never go into the ring and box face to face, We are going to be challenging each other all over the world, and we're going to help support places. Stalin's going to help support places that are moving towards communism. Truman and the United States are going to help support places that are trying to fight against communism, and that's why it's known as the Cold War. In 1946, Churchill already sees this world developing, and he gives this speech that's famously known as the Iron Curtain speech, that an Iron Curtain has descended in Europe that is permanently dividing and separating the eastern part of Europe from the western part of Europe. And so, again, that's in 1946, shortly after the war is over, and they're already splitting apart on some of these key issues. So now we're going to fast forward, and Europe is a bit in disarray post-World War II. And the big fear is that because of all the destruction, because of needing to rebuild, that these places in Europe are pretty vulnerable to communist influences, and that communism is always kind of seeking a way to get into these places and kind of work against U.S. interests. And so the first two that we really see battling this are Greece and Turkey. And that raises some alarm bells, at least for American policymakers and the American government. And that's where Truman is going to propose his Truman Doctrine. What the United States needs to do is we need to pour money and resources, our energies, advisors, whatever is really necessary into these countries that are fighting communism. And the hope here is that not only are we going to export kind of American values, but by investing in these countries, we are going to do really kind of two things at once. That we're going to look after our economic interests at home, but we're also going to address some of our foreign policy concerns at the same time. Now, one of the things when you look at exporting American values, one of the things that we'll see is that democracy is kind of a hard thing, because in order for the U.S. to kind of be able to have stability in leadership, democracy doesn't really promote that. So in some cases, we kind of work counter to democracy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in Section 3. So Keenan is the chief foreign policy advisor, and he argues for containment. And his belief is that the Soviet Union is trying to export communism. However, at the same time, they aren't going to be willing to risk everything with a direct confrontation with the United States. So when we start looking at this policy of containment, what he really is saying is that if the United States stands up, draws lines in the sand, is somewhat assertive with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union more than likely is going to back down. But this also means that we have to be 100% on board here, that we have to be willing to put all of our resources, all of our energies, all of our willpower into the containment of communism. And if we don't do that, then we are really at risk of losing the world to communism. Post-World War II, we see Europe in disarray. I've already talked a little bit about that. So the United States policymakers are asking, what can we do to help prevent the rise of fascist leaders like we saw post-World War I? What can we do to help prevent the Great Depression like we saw after World War I? And what can we do to make communism seem less attractive? And General Marshall comes up with this plan to aid European countries, that we will put all kinds of money into Europe so that they can rebuild, so that they can get back on their feet again. And this is an extremely successful program. And the other thing that it shows, again, going back to kind of Greece and Turkey, is it reinforces our idea that we can look after our economic interests at home, because one of the conditions here is if you receive money from the United States, you have to buy American goods. And so this money is really going to come back to the United States, and it's going to help make our economy boom. And we'll talk about that in the 1950s. The other thing it does is it shores up our foreign policy interests. It's going to protect our interests in that part of the world. When we look at the Berlin airlift, the United States, what you see here, this is the part of Germany that they contain. This is the part that France has. This is the part that Great Britain has. And what these three countries announce is the unification of what's going to become West Germany. They're going to take their zones and they're combine them into one country. And Stalin is not happy about this at all. He believed that they had agreed that Germany was going to be divided forever by these four powers, and that these four powers were going to forever be in these occupation zones. So, in retaliation, what Stalin does is he seizes Berlin, which is in the heart of the Soviet held occupation zone. And the city of Berlin was divided up just like the rest of Germany. Part of it belonged to Russia, and the United States, Great Britain, and France each had their own section of Berlin. And what he hopes to do is hold Berlin hostage and force those other three countries to get rid of this plan of unification. At that point, President Truman is facing a pretty tough choice here. Initially, it looks like he has really kind of two options. Option one is to back down to Stalin, which probably isn't going to be a good thing because, again, if you back down to Stalin this time, he's going to think he can push your hand and force you into giving up your interests, and so we don't really want to do that. Option two is to get the U.S. military ready, the French military ready, the British military ready, and march against the Soviet Union, and almost immediately after World War II enter into World War III. That isn't a very good option either. Somewhere along the line, someone proposes a different solution. The idea here is that Stalin had guaranteed free airspace to be able to fly into and out of Berlin. So the Allies are going to make use of that airspace, and they are going to fly in supplies, gas, clothing, food, water, whatever is necessary to help the people of West Berlin survive this. The results of this is that we demonstrate to the world our commitment not just to West Germany and to the people of West Berlin, but we show the world that we are dedicated to fighting communism, and even if we have to come up with very creative ideas to do it. And so we walk away looking like creative, innovative, energetic, enthusiastic problem solvers, and Stalin to the rest of the world kind of comes across as a bit of a bully. So it helps the United States, it bolsters the United States. In some ways it hurts Stalin and Russia's causes. Now, one of the other things that grows out of this is that the United States and our allies realize that we probably need to figure out a way to organize ourselves to defend against the Soviet aggression. So what's going to happen is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is going to be developed, and this is an organization that pledges mutual defense of each other. So if one of these countries are attacked, we view it as all of these countries being attacked. And what this shows is how NATO has grown and expanded. The most recent country is Macedonia, which would be over here by Greece. They were added just in the last 6 months or so. Stalin then creates the Warsaw Pact that's going to solidify those satellite countries that he has control over, and really it falls along the lines of this Iron Curtain. So now we have this very formal two alliance groups, NATO versus Warsaw Pact, that are going to be butting heads throughout Europe.